All right, folks, let's get into some endocrine glands. Now, before we get into all the little tiny glands that we have to talk about, we got to talk about the master control center of the endocrine system, and that is the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is going to be in the brain, of course. It's located below the thalamus in the brain. You can see the thalamus here. It's located right below it. And it's the endocrine system's way to connect with the nervous system. So sometimes you'll see the hypothalamus is considered a neuroendocrine organ because it has the ability to connect the brain to hormone control. Now, how does it do that? Well, as we can see, the hypothalamus is connected to the pituitary gland. The pituitary is made up of two parts, the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary, and their connections, how these nerves are getting to the pituitary gland to release hormones, is through the infundibulum. And that's going to be like a little canal that's going to connect the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. And it's the hypothalamus that actually regulates the pituitary gland's hormone release. So it's the thing that's going to be maintaining homeostasis, temperature, thirst, hunger, and the stress response. And how does it do that? By using its neurons to, of course, release hormones. And not only does it release hormones, it can release other hormones that's going to inhibit the pituitary gland from working as well. So let's get an example here. Some releasing hormones of the hypothalamus are going to be like thyroid stimulating hormone, for example, or follicle stimulating hormone, or luteinizing hormone that we'll talk about as we get into the anterior pituitary. Okay, so that has the ability to stimulate the anterior pituitary. So here's our little neurons just saying, hey, anterior pituitary, release these particular hormones. And it's going to do its job, right? But then you have a situation where it says, okay, you're releasing too much of those hormones, or you get a stimulus that says, hey, we're done with this amount of hormones that we have. So then you're going to have some inhibiting hormones that the hypothalamus also releases and says, stop. Stop producing these particular hormones. We don't need them anymore, and we're going to suppress the anterior pituitary. Also have situations where there's hormones that's made in the hypothalamus and stored in, for example, the posterior pituitary gland. And those hormones are going to be ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and also oxytocin. We'll talk about those when we get to the posterior pituitary gland, okay? And so the hypothalamus is very unique because, of course, the neurons is going to convert nerve impulses into hormone release for the anterior pituitary, but it also makes different hormones that are stored in the posterior pituitary and allows those to be released as well. If this is our master of control, then what are going to be the targets for the hypothalamus? It's going to be the pituitary gland that lies below it. Okay, and remember, the connection between the two allows us to have a connection between the nervous system and the endocrine system. So let's get into some more glands. Now let's get into the anterior pituitary gland. So again, we have our hypothalamus, and then we have the anterior lobe of the pituitary, and then we have the posterior lobe. Now, a lot of times, you'll see that sometimes you have different orientations where the anterior lobe and posterior lobe, depending on how you're actually viewing it in space and whatever photo you get, could be switched. So just keep that in mind as well. But when we're talking about the anterior pituitary, we know it's going to be connected to the hypothalamus, and of course, it's going to be below the hypothalamus. Where it's going to be its targets. Well, we saw a lot of different hormones that are going to be released from the anterior pituitary based on whatever signals the hypothalamus are giving. So there's a lot of hormones you have to focus on when it comes to anterior pituitary. So they have targets to the thyroid. They actually can then target other endocrine glands to release their particular hormones, which is also why the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland are super important. So it can have targets of the thyroid, adrenal cortex, the gonads, which again are other endocrine glands, also mammary glands, and body tissues. And the whole goal of the anterior pituitary is to control growth, metabolism, stress, and reproduction. How does it do that? Through the hormones that it releases. So here are the hormones, the main hormones it releases here. And there's a little mnemonic you can remember, flat peg. So follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, thyroid stimulating hormone, prolactin, and growth hormone, or flat peg, okay? So FSH is going to be for sperm formation and egg development. So that's the whole goal of this hormone, which again, it controls growth. Luteinizing hormone stimulates the release of, again, it's going to be our sex hormones here. We need to release sex hormones, and luteinizing hormone is going to do that straight from the anterior pituitary. ACTH is going to stimulate the release of hormones in the adrenal cortex. So it's going to take this hormone to then cause the adrenal cortex, we're going to get into later, to release its hormone. You see how there's always a connection. Hypothalamus is running this, And this then is going to be running different types of endocrine glands. Also, thyroid stimulating hormone is going to stimulate the secretion of thyroid hormone. So again, now we also have thyroid, another endocrine gland that's going to stimulate the secretion of those particular hormones as well. Prolactin is going to stimulate milk production, and growth hormone is going to increase cell division because you're trying to grow. Remember, we talked about one of the functions of the endocrine system is for growth, going from a baby to a teen. Well, it's going to be the growth hormone that aids in that through the anterior pituitary. About the anterior pituitary, let's talk about the posterior pituitary. We already knew the two hormones that are going to be focused on the posterior pituitary. Remember, they store and release ADH and oxytocin, or antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. Another way of saying antidiuretic hormone is going to be vasopressin, so keep that in mind as well. And one way you can think of the posterior pituitary gland is powerful antioxidant. Okay, so anti and then oxidant is how we're going to get our oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. Now, we know the posterior pituitary gland is connected to the hypothalamus through that channel, right? Or infundibulum. And we also know that it's a part of the the pituitary gland. Okay? What's going to be its targets? The uterus, mammary glands, kidneys, and blood vessels. And why? Because the whole function of the posterior pituitary gland, and therefore its hormones, is to regulate water balance, help with childbirth and lactation, and basically store ADH and oxytocin, just like the hypothalamus tells it to. So antidiuretic hormone is saying that if you have a decrease in urine production, this is going to increase water in the blood. If you have more water kept in the blood, that's going to increase the blood volume, and it's going to help prevent like dehydration and maintain blood pressure. Of course, you can say the opposite. If you have an increased urine output, then you're going to have less of a use of this antidiuretic hormone because you're going to have less water in the blood, a decreased blood volume, and of course, a dehydration rate. You also have oxytocin, which is going to initiate uterine contractions. Okay? I don't know why I put even. And milk release. So we already talked about in the anterior pituitary that prolactin is going to stimulate milk production, but we need oxytocin for that milk release. Okay? Next, we're going to have the pineal gland, which is going to be, or you can also say pineal gland, which is going to be in our brain as well. It's going to be located in the epithalamus. So we're going to have our thalamus, we're going to have the hypothalamus below it, then we're going to have a pituitary gland, and then we're going to have above it is going to be our epithalamus. Okay? And that's where the pineal gland is. And this is going to target the brain and the hypothalamus. Okay? Its function is to regulate circadian rhythms, which basically means our sleep-wake cycles and, of course, our seasonal patterns. So you can say that the hormone that's going to do that is melatonin. And melatonin is going to help with our sleep-wake cycle. Okay? And when it comes to trying to remember what the pineal gland does, you can also say, go to sleep, pinhead. And so pineal, pin, that's how you can make that connection as well. Let's move on. Our next glands are the thyroid gland, and then on the thyroid gland are the parathyroid glands. Okay, so here we have our thyroid gland. Sometimes people also say it looks like a butterfly. Let me get a better color. This one here, right? And as you can see, this is going to be the anterior portion of the neck. It's kind of below the larynx, and it's wrapping around the trachea here. Okay? And the target is going to be most body cells and bone. So that's going to be the target cells for this thyroid gland. Now, what's its function? Number one, control metabolic rate and oxygen use, energy production, and calcium homeostasis. So that's a lot going on. And when we're talking about metabolic rate, we're talking about the ability to process the food we eat, break it down for energy. So it's going to be connected and regulating all those pieces there. Okay? And then we're talking about the parathyroid. There are going to be 4 small glands on the posterior surface of the thyroid. So we have the anterior portion here. We turn this around. We're going to have our 4 little parathyroid glands that, again, are on the posterior surface of the thyroid. Their targets are the bones, the kidneys, and the intestines. And their function is to do one thing, increase blood calcium. How do they do this? Stimulating blood reabsorption, talking osteoclasts, enhancing calcium reabsorption in the kidneys, activating vitamin D, and increasing intestinal absorption as well. But how are we going to kind of connect these both together? We're going to remember this as calcium and carbs. That's what the thyroid and parathyroid glands do. So when it comes to metabolic rate and oxygen use and being able to control our metabolism, there's going to be 2 hormones that do that, thyroxine T4, and triethylthiourine, which is T3. And these are going to be our major metabolic hormones to aid in figuring out how we break down food, use it for energy, and of course, oxygen use as well. Okay. And then next, we're going to have calcitonin, which again, the thyroid is going to deal in calcium homeostasis. And this is going to decrease calcium ions in the blood. So if you're decreasing calcium ions in the blood, it has to go somewhere. And of course, you can store calcium in our bones as well. Now, for the parathyroid hormones, that parathyroid is going to release the parathyroid hormone that can increase calcium ions in the blood. So let's go back to a skeletal system where we know we had osteoclasts. And those osteoclasts can break down bone cells and release calcium ions into the blood. And the parathyroid hormone can help stimulate that when you need more calcium in the blood, for example. All right, let's move on to our next set of hormones, which are going to be our thymus and adrenal glands. So the thymus is very interesting because the thymus is basically behind the sternum. So you see it kind of here, it's behind the sternum. And its whole goal and role of the thymus is to help with the immune or building our immune system during our youth. And so what does it build? It uses a hormone called thymosin. And thymosin is going to help white blood cells in our blood, called T lymphocytes or T cells, mature. Okay, that's the whole goal. And what are T cells? T cells basically are going to be defending the body from any kind of pathogens that you may have. Now, after puberty, after we've actually built our immune system and it stabilizes, we no longer really use the thymus that much. It actually ends up shrinking after our puberty. So it gets way smaller. Okay, it gets way smaller. And we don't really need it as much because we already have our immune system that we need. Now, if you're in a situation where you have to basically try to rebuild your immune system, maybe you'll see more response from the thymus. Maybe you'll see more thymosin being used. But a lot of times you see it before puberty. Okay? Next, we have our adrenal glands, which we know are going to sit atop the kidney. So you see it looks like little hats on the kidneys here. And anytime you think of adrenal glands, just think stress. Adrenaline is equal to stress. Okay? So that's the only thing you can think about. And the reason why is because adrenaline is going to be epinephrine. And we usually think of epinephrine hormone for our fight or flight response. And that happens when you're in kind of emergency situations or super excited, for example. And again, stress is going to be related to the hormones called glucocorticoids or cortisol. And so the targets for adrenal glands are going to be our kidneys, our liver, our heart, our muscles, our vessels as well, because it's going to help regulate metabolism, but specifically in relation to the stress response. When you are stressed and you have a release of like cortisol, for example, it can change your metabolism. It can increase your blood sugar. And so if you're increasing your blood sugar, some folks might feel even more hungry and things like that. And so that could cause you to have more weight. And think about being a person who has diabetes and you're trying to regulate your blood sugar. If you are stressed on top of having diabetes, then you can automatically have an increase in blood sugar just from that as well. They kind of go hand in hand. Okay? And of course, it also deals with electrolyte balance as you're trying to deal with your kidneys and figure out how many ions you may have in your kidneys as well. All right, so when you're thinking of adrenal gland hormones, think of cortisol or glucocorticoids. They're part of the stress response. And also epinephrine and norepinephrine, they're going to be part of that fight or flight response. And remember, with any of these glands, you can add more details to whatever's going to help you remember, right? So go to the tables in your textbook. Make sure you're saying, okay, well, she might have said this and this, but I want to add in this when I'm thinking of the adrenal gland. Do this on your own. Make your own little tiny tables for this, or note parts, whatever's going to help you remember the information. Right. Our next endocrine glands are going to be the pancreas, and then finally we'll end with the gonads. So pancreas first. Pancreas is going to be behind the stomach, and the pancreas is cool because it's made of specific endocrine cells. But also is really great because it can actually be an endocrine gland and it can function as an exocrine gland as well. So endocrine glands, we said, are ductless, right? There are no ducts secreting it. It just secretes the actual hormones themselves. But an exocrine gland do have ducts that are going to secrete certain enzymes or whatever have. The pancreas is going to act as an endocrine gland and is going to act as exocrine and have exocrine function. Because it's so close to the stomach, and of course the small intestines, it has the ability to function as an exocrine gland because it can release digestive enzymes through little ducts to the small intestine. Okay? But of course, our focus is to see how it relates to the endocrine glands. And when it comes to endocrine glands, you have to basically take a piece of the pancreas to look at its cells that are inside of it. And there's two types of cells, the alpha cells and the beta cells, that are going to produce two types of hormones to help maintain glucose homeostasis in the body. So first we're going to have our alpha cells, which is here, and then we're going to have our beta cells. Okay? Alpha cells are going to release a particular hormone called glucagon, and beta cells are going to produce insulin, and that's also a hormone. Okay? So they're going to act in opposite. One is going to increase blood sugar, one's going to decrease blood sugar. Or another way you can think of it is, if you have a decrease in blood sugar, one is going to try to increase. If you have an increase in blood sugar, one's going to try to decrease. So it just depends on how you want to relate that information. So if I'm looking at both these hormones, if I want to decrease blood sugar, then I need insulin, because insulin is going to take up glucose and store it as glycogen. But if I want to increase blood sugar, I can definitely use glucagon, for example, because glucagon is going to take glycogen and break it down into glucose that can then go into the bloodstream. So it just depends on what your body needs. If you have very, very low blood sugar, you're probably going to want to use glucagon to increase it. If you have high blood sugar, you're probably going to need insulin to decrease it. Okay? Now, the target cells of these hormones are everywhere you might have some stored glucose, which could be your liver, your muscles, and some also adipose tissue. Let's get into our last endocrine gland, which are going to be the gonads. Now, the gonads are going to be our sex hormones, okay? And sex hormones are going to be released by the ovaries, which you see here, and the testes, which are going to be our gonads. And so the location is going to be the testes or the scrotum outside the pelvic cavity, and the ovaries are going to be inside the pelvic cavity, that's lateral to the uterus. You see those ovaries here and the basically the testes there. Now, there's two main hormones that are going to be released. Estrogen and progesterone are going to be released for the ovaries, and these are going to be for females, and testosterone is for males. Okay? The whole focus is reproductive organs. Reproductive organs, bones, muscles, brain, skin, all that's going to be some target areas for the gonads, because their whole goal is to produce gametes, which are going to be our sex cells, right, and create secondary sex characteristics. So, for example, estrogen and progesterone is really good for helping, of course, with your menstrual cycle and supporting pregnancy, and of course, female traits. So some of those secondary sex characteristics could be like developing breast, for example. Whereas testosterone is for male secondary characteristics, which is like deepening the voice, hair on the chest, increasing muscle mass, details like that. And so if we go back and we just look at all of the different glands we talked about so far, again, for hypothalamus, it's going to be our control center. Anterior pituitary has a lot of hormones is released because it acts on other endocrine glands as well, causing them to release their hormones. Posterior pituitary and pineal gland, okay, we got those two as well. Different ways to remember them. Powerful antioxidant for posterior pituitary. Endocrine glands like thymus and adrenal glands, like we see here, adrenaline equals stress. That's one way to remember both of the different types of hormones for the actual adrenal glands. And the adrenal glands are important, right? I'm just showing you epinephrine and norepinephrine and the glucocorticoids or cortisol, but there's so many things you could be looking at here. You can be looking at androgens for sex characteristics, metabolism and stress ones. You also can be looking at aldosterone for salt balance if you want to focus mainly on the kidneys here. And again, if you want to just talk about prepping for emergencies, then we already have epinephrine and norepinephrine. What I'm showing you is not every single one. So you might say, hey, I looked at the adrenal glands, but these aren't the ones. This isn't the hormones I want to use to focus on the adrenal glands. I'm trying to give you the major ones, but of course, there's a lot of other ones you can choose. All right, next we have our pancreas. Again, if you want to remember the pancreas, you can say pancreas is covered in blue. N is for insulin. Blue is for glucagon. That can help you remember those hormones. And then finally, the gonads are going to be our sex hormones. So you think estrogen, testosterone, that'll be the way you get it there. Now, the next video, we're going to get into how to regulate all these hormones. How do we do that? So we already talked about the introduction to the endocrine system. Then we talked about all the endocrine glands and the hormones they release. Well, how do we regulate them? Because I know we talked a little bit about the hypothalamus and how it helps regulate homeostasis by, again, releasing other hormones that then inhibit certain hormones. So we're going to get into those details as we go on. See you in the next video.